Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this program, Totem Poles, the Past and the Present, with Aldona Janitis. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the programming team here at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month, we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is timber. It's been a fun month. To find more free programs, you can go to our web calendar at deschuteslibrary.org/calendar, or you can go on our YouTube channel to find recordings of programs like this one. If you have questions for the presenter during the program, please use the Q&A and we'll have her answer them at the end of the presentation. Our presenter is Aldona Janitis. Aldona is an art historian who's worked for decades on the art of Northwest Coast Indigenous people. Among her many books are The Totem Pole, an intercultural history written with Aaron Glass, and Discovering Totem Poles. She is the retired director of the University of Alaska Museum of the North. Thank you so much, Aldona, for talking to us about the history and present use of totem poles by Indigenous people.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I would just like to warn you just a little bit. I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, on 20 acres off the grid, in a relatively remote place from Fairbanks, and my internet is not always as stable as it might be. So I hope it all works out okay. The other thing I want to apologize for is that we have dogs in this house and sometimes they bark. So I hope everything is fine. Okay, well, let me start by putting my PowerPoint on the screen. Okay, this is a talk about totem poles, and the reason I call it an intercultural history is that the development of poles, as we know them today, as they populate cities all over, including the Northwest, is the product of many, many years of intercultural exchange between natives and non-natives. And so I think you might find some interesting facts about totem poles that you may or may not have known. And the story begins in Yuquot, which is Friendly Cove on the west coast of Vancouver Island. In 1778, Captain Cook visited Yuquot for the first time. And if you notice, this is a Nuchanoth village, and there are no totem poles outside the houses. This is just flat shed roofed houses. Then when you went into a chief's house, what you would see are house posts that represented some kind of being. And the beings that are represented on these house posts and later in totem poles are owned by the family. They are images of mythic beings that in some time in the past interacted with an ancestor and gave them their privileges, the right to depict them in art, and their rank. This was a ranked society. So some people who had interiors like this one were noble, and some people who were less noble or commoners very often had very few decoration inside. So this is the first contact that the Indigenous people of the Northwest had with non-natives. And only in 1791, which was, over 10 years past this initial interaction, the Haida of Haida Gwaii, Queen Charlotte Islands, the very first totem pole that was actually seen by a non-native was in 1791. And this is a drawing of a pole in a village in Haida Gwaii. And it's a 40-foot pole, and the artist obviously couldn't figure out how to do Northwest Coast art. But it is the first indication, and it's probably the case that once the Northwest Coast Native people got metal tools from their interactions with the traders, they could make much larger wooden carvings much more quickly. And so then the poles that had been on the interior, and some of them continue to be in the interior, ended up being on the exterior and showed everybody the history of the clan that lived in the house and its prestige. So it's probable that the totem pole, the pole went from being an interior house post to a totem pole as we know it, probably here in Haida Gwaii, and maybe across the strait in this is Tsimshian territory. Then it slowly began to migrate up north, and then it began to migrate down south. And the totem pole never actually got to your area, although today there are totem poles that are carved by many, many different people, indigenous groups. So the poles in Haida Gwaii were remarkable. I mean, they're just gorgeous. Here's an 1880 shot of Skidegate in Haida Gwaii with these slanted pitch-roofed houses, and the houses held extended families, maybe with 40 or 50 people, and many, many totem poles standing in front of the houses. And they were, again, indications of the family, its prestige, its status, the mythic beings that it was connected to, and its history. So this was in Haida Gwaii. And then the totem pole began moving a little bit north, and it went across the border into Alaska. And this is Kasan in 1891. And here you see a similar array of pretty impressive poles. Some of the poles, as you go a little bit further north in the panhandle of Alaska, the poles get to be a little bit less fancy, a little bit plainer. And this is Cherished, which is a small village which is no longer exists. But you can see some poles there, and they're not nearly as complex and tall as the ones that you just saw from the Haida. Then if you go really far north into Klukwan, which is near Haines, if any of you have taken the ferry to Alaska, this is a very conservative village, and they didn't believe in totem poles because they said totem poles are foreign. And so what they did is to instead, and here's a house called the Whale House. If you look at the outside, it's completely undecorated. But then you go inside the house, and then this is what you see when you go into the house: abundant carving. And you have the two house posts, these two house posts, and then there are two more house posts. You're looking from the entrance into the house. There are two more house posts at the entrance that mirror the two house posts that you see there. And so instead of making tall totem poles outside the house, they kept their house posts inside and did not make poles in that particular time. Okay, the story, I'm going to be going very quickly through the idea of the history of the totem pole. Native culture, indigenous culture was, I'll just go to the next one. Indigenous culture was whites, missionaries, and government officials tried very hard to eradicate their culture and to transform them into, missionize them. And many of them did get converted. Many missionaries were very good. Some were not so good, and some government officials were okay, and some were truly horrible. When the miners came in, they began stealing the land. And now I'm specifically speaking about Alaska because that's where I live. The miners and the government officials took away the land of the people. They impoverished the people because these people were salmon fishermen, and the invaders, shall we call them, appropriated everything that they had. And so they kept on getting smaller and smaller areas in which to live. And so they had to figure out ways that they could cope with making a living. And so they began to make tourist art because there were lots of tourists who were coming to Alaska starting in the 1880s. The same trip that people take in those huge steamships from Washington State up here. They started in Seattle and they went up and they went to the glaciers and they went to look at native villages. So this is a pole. This is a shop in Juneau at 1900 where you can see poles on sale, large scale poles and smaller poles, and some of the poles are even just on the inside of the house, less than a foot big. This was called tourist art, and people love to buy it. And then, as you can see, the totem pole was by this point a real draw for tourists because it was called. This is a 1906 brochure for a Pacific Coast Steamship Company, and it's called the Totem Pole Route. So they actually named their excursions for this really, really vivid and interesting poles. And here is another pole. This is a little bit later in the 30s, but again, to go to Alaska, you were going to look at totem poles. Here is in 1900 a picture of some tourists in the town Ketchikan, and very proudly standing in front of the poles that still stood in Ketchikan at that point. Then I showed you this village, Kasan, which was entitled A Place of Totemic Delight, because there were so many totem poles there. Now, the problem with tourism and settlement, people were really coming in and settling in these in all of the Northwest. The Native people were discouraged from carving, discouraged from having their ceremonies. They were impoverished. They needed to get jobs in canneries and fisheries and places like that. And they stopped making these monumental carvings. And in many places, I stopped making any carvings except for like model totem poles. But that actually, those are indications of the importance of the pole and the cultural importance of the images on the pole that were meant, that still maintained their cultural identity. Just because they were being sold didn't mean that they weren't meaningful. So poles began to stop being carved in the in the certainly 1900s. So up when there was tourism, the only people who had seen totem poles were people who actually went to the Northwest. But then it turned out that even though you had the oppression and suppression of indigenous culture, there was also a fascination with their traditional art and other kinds of creative forms. And so there, this in the turn of the century, there were a lot of World's Fairs, and the World's Fairs, the people who ran the World's Fairs said, "Oh, well, the Smithsonian in the United States and these other places had pavilions," and they said we should have totem poles to show what is made in the far off Northwest. And so the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, you can see on the right side of this slide a bunch of totem poles that had been transported from the Northwest. Not everyone thought these poles were really useful because in a newspaper, Philadelphia newspaper, they were described ugly, crude, and barbaric. Then the Chicago World's Fair in 1897, again, lots of totem poles were brought to Chicago. And in this case, you have a house in the middle where the anthropologist Franz Boas, if you've heard of his name, he's the father of American anthropology, had a group of Kwakiutl or Kwakwakiwak people come and live in that house during the time of the fair and had them perform dances and songs. And it was really interesting because even though Native people were subjected to tremendous racism in places where they lived, in big cities where there weren't so many, their culture was fascinating. And the most important thing that was believed at this point is that the cultures were disappearing. And somehow the nice things, the great things that the Native people had done needed to be preserved. And so all of the material that came to the Chicago World's Fair in 1897 remained at the Field Museum in Chicago, if any of you have ever been there. Well, back to Alaska, there was a Governor Brady, who had been a missionary in amongst the Tlingit who lived there, and said, well, we should collect a lot of poles because young people need to know what their culture was like before they became civilized, quote unquote. And so Brady asked a bunch of chiefs in various villages if they would donate poles to him, to the government, the Alaskan government, so that they can set them up in a totem pole park that would be a way of teaching young people and also non-natives about the culture that was no longer the case. And so if they first went to these poles first went to the St. Louis World's Fair, to the Alaska building, because the governor had thought, well, we need to bring, in order to be a state, we need a lot of people to be coming into and moving here. So we need to attract them and show them that this is not a land of cold and ice only. And so he said, well, people love totem poles. Let's have all these totem poles erected at the Alaska Pavilion. And here it is with a lot of totem poles in front of the Alaska Pavilion itself is the white building to the far left. And they brought a clan house as well as erecting a lot of these poles. He brought the poles, actually also went to the 1905 Portland Fair, and here it is. They are lined up again along the river. Then they went back to the Sitka National Historical Park, which is in Alaska, and they were all erected in that place, in that park. Well, what's interesting about that, but anyone who's been to Sitka has always gone to the National Historic Park because it's a beautiful park. It's got a beautiful stroll through the woods. And each moment you turn, you see another totem pole. They're gorgeous. They're just magical. And the problem was that, and here's the old totem poles as they stood in front of the houses in the villages. And here's the the totem pole that was erected in Sitka. The thing about this Sitka National Historical Park is that there were never totem poles in Sitka. Sitka, like the other, like Klukwan, the more northern group, did not believe in totem poles, so there weren't any up until this point. The indigenous people didn't make poles. The white people brought the poles in and put them in a park. Then poles began being very popular as items to remove. Museums were going to the Northwest from the 1880s on, collecting poles, buying them, or just taking them. This is Tongas in 1890, a village where the people were no longer living in this village because they had to move to another town, basically a white town where they could get jobs. However, they still owned the land. The poles still represented their heritage. But what happened is that a bunch of Seattle businessmen in 1899 took a steamship trip up to Alaska to talk about the interactions of business, how business could be developed between Seattle and Alaska. Well, they went to Tongas. They saw that there were not any people there. They said, "Oh, this has been removed. These people, this has been abandoned, and we will take it, and it will become the symbol of our great city." And Seattle, which had never had poles either, because the people who lived in Seattle, the Salish, were not totem pole makers ever. But then all of a sudden, Seattle became known as a totem pole city. And here was the Seattle Washington Fair, and you can see in the middle, this is a brochure for the fair, that's the Seattle totem pole. And just as an aside, notice that the pole is in the middle, and then to the left of the pole are some dog mushers. They were indigenous Inupiat, Inuit. And so they're complete, and the Inuit live way up in the north, and the totem poles were from way in the south, but these people don't much care about real geography and real ethnic identity. So I just wanted to share, this is hysterical. The entryway to the fair, because Seattle was so connected to totem poles, it's sort of like, it's kind of like a Japanese or Chinese entryway, because this was a Pacific fair. So it did celebrate the Asian connections too. But the pillars that are on those that support the roof are all totem poles. And you see the eyes, those are all light bulbs. And so in the evening, these eyes begin to be illuminated. Seattle loved totem poles so much, they had the Potlatch Days. And here you have the parade of walking totem poles. Okay, so the government, this is true of Canada and the United States, the government, then this is Governor Brady did this too when he removed the poles so that people could, the future inheritors of Native culture would know what their traditions were. So the poles that had been disdained as indications of paganism, which they're not religious at all, and ethnic identity and barbarism, now after the 20s and the 30s, all of a sudden non-natives began saying, well, these poles are just decaying in these villages. We need to salvage them so that they don't get depressed, that they don't disappear. And so during the Depression, the US government sponsored programs that hired Native people to work. And in Alaska, there were totem pole restoration projects from 1939 to 40. And what you had here is poles from various villages that were no longer inhabited were brought to various villages, communities, which did have settlements, and they were restored. And here you have a group of men restoring one of these poles. And today, if you go to Ketchikan, the poles that are here are from the WPA project. And here you're looking down from the house on the top of the hill past these poles. This is also, there were no poles in Juneau in prehistoric times. The Juneau Native people did not make poles either, but now it's known as a place of great totem poles. And here is also another part of Ketchikan in the Totem Bight. And these are all WPA Public Works Project creations. Well, bringing the story up much more to today, the poles which had been taken, and this is true of Native culture in general, as we get to the end of the 20th century, Indigenous people begin to reclaim their culture because non-natives had brought the poles to museums, erected them in natural history museums. They had confiscated poles, they had stolen poles. They had told Native people, you shouldn't make these, this is bad. And so they themselves did not make any poles for their communities. The poles that were made before the end of the 20th century were all sponsored by governments and so on and so forth. Well, in the 1960s, with all the movements of liberation of oppressed people, Native Americans also started to say, well, wait a minute, we have power. We have been mistreated, and that's a very gentle word for how they were treated. And we want to regain our cultures, and we want to have sovereignty over our land. We are very angry at the government, and we are not happy that so much has been removed from our communities. There's more art in New York City of the Tlingit than there was at that time in Alaska. So as the Native people of Alaska, and this is true of British Columbia as well, began to revitalize their culture and become empowered, they began, one of the consequences of this empowerment of Native Americans in the Northwest Coast was the transformation of totem poles into their expressions of various ideas, some of which are political. And this brings us back to 1899. There was an expedition led by Harriman, J.G. Harriman or something like that, of the railroad magnate. And in 1899, he brought a group of friends, scientists, artists. It was a very highly educated and interesting group from Seattle, and brought them into the Bering Sea, and they traveled all around Alaska, and they did a lot of very, very interesting because there were naturalists on this trip too. And as they were going back, they went to Cape Fox. And just like Tongas with the Seattle businessmen, Cape Fox had a lot of poles that were standing, and the village had nobody in it. And again, this did not mean the village, the land, or the poles were abandoned. This simply meant that the people were making wages in the other communities where they could get jobs. So members of the Harriman Expedition said, okay, we need to bring these poles back to a variety of different colleges and universities that were represented by some of the people in the on the expedition. So they were taken down and put on the ship and taken down to Seattle and put on trains. And some went to Cornell, and some went to Harvard, some went to the University of Washington, and some went to other places. And the people whose culture it was, just they had nothing they could do. They were so disempowered at that point. So then in 1990, the United States government passed the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. And that was about museums had to return graves and skeletal remains. If a group wanted to have its skeletal remains, it had to be returned. If there were items that were buried with the dead, they had to be returned. Then there were two other categories. One is religious items, and one is items of cultural patrimony. And they needed to be returned under certain circumstances. And as part of the NAGPRA legislation, the museums had to send the communities lists of all the items that they had in their collections from that community. And all of a sudden, these people who were descendants of Cape Fox village discovered that their poles were in these universities all over the place. And they asked for them back. And several years later, the Burke Museum at the University of Washington took its house posts that had been removed and put it on a ferry. And here you have one of the house posts being lowered from the ship onto the dock in their community. And here you have, it's a return of the bear poles to Ketchikan. This happened in 2001. And here you have the poles being welcomed back. So finally, indigenous culture is coming back to where it had been originally. The people from Cape Fox said, we will, when you return our treasures, we will give you logs, cedar logs, to make replicas as you wish of the poles that had been returned. So the Burke Museum, there were 2 house posts that had been returned that represent the Bear Mother. And these are 2 poles from the Burke Museum by a father and son team, Stephen and Nathan Jackson. And Nathan is the senior person, and he's the father. And so his pole was very much like the original pole, looked very much like the original Bear Mother pole. His son, who was very creative and very original, wanted a pole that was much more contemporary. And so instead of carving wood, he made this pole at the right out of epoxy. And what it represents, the story of the Bear Mother was a story of the death and dismemberment of a person by a bear. And it's much more complicated than that. And so what he did is Stephen Jackson just took different body parts and put it all over this epoxy statue. And he also said, this communicates the violence of the story, but it also communicates the violence that was done to my people. And so you have a very different attitude between father and son in how they decided to depict two copies of the returned poles. Then in 1980, Nathan Jackson, the man who's the pole that you just saw, and Steve Brown made this pole in Juneau, and it's called the Wushkitan pole. And what that's about is that in 1869, the United States government bombed the village of Angoon, the native village, bombed the whole village, destroyed the whole village, and it was truly just violent and for no reason. And this is a pole that is a response to that bombing, because at the very top of that pole is Uncle Sam. And the reason that Uncle Sam is here is that the United States government has never apologized for the bombing of Angoon. So this is what you might call a shame pole. It's trying to shame the United States government. And here's another side of that. Then you also have another pole called the Seward pole. Seward, who was Secretary of State, actually was the name of the man who's designated in history as the man who did Seward's Folly, which was he bought Alaska from the Russians. This is a Seward pole that was made in the early in 1900, and the reason for that pole is that when Seward came to visit Alaska, the chief of this particular community gave him a lavish feast, and he never returned it. And he never that. And you have to reciprocate these things. So the chief put up this pole, and you can see it in situ in the left-hand slide, a pole with a figure at the very top. That's Seward. And he is being mocked. It's a shame pole. And this is a indication of how outrageously bad he had behaved. Well, that pole began to deteriorate. And so Stephen Jackson, the son of Nathan, who did the Bear Mother pole, made a new version of the Seward pole. And I just ask you to look at that face and look at the body. And it's a pretty remarkable pole. And it's a tremendously insulting image of a man who deserved to be insulted. Now you get poles all over the place. If you go to the Pilchuk glass school, excuse me, there's this really extraordinary pole that shows people, non-natives on it, because the two poles that I just showed you do have non-natives on them, but the poles are intended to shame them. Whereas here, this is a pole that is honoring Chihuly, who is the glass artist who started Pilchuk glass school, and John and Ann Halberg, who were great philanthropists, who gave a huge amount of art to the Seattle Art Museum and also to the book. And this is an honor. Sorry. This is a pole that honors Chihuly and John and Ann Halberg. The top figure is Ann Halberg, the philanthropist, wearing a Northwest Coast robe. Right underneath her, there's a face with a glass over the eye. Chihuly had only one functioning eye, so that's Chihuly. And at the very bottom is John Halberg with a image of a knife that he returned to the museum in a repatriation. So not all images of non-native people are negative. And I just wanted to show you that, to point that out. Then in communities, then you're finally having poles being erected in communities and having depictions of themes that never have been seen in the past, but are critical to today's Native lives. Wayne Price is a Tlingit carver, and who has very proud of having been sober for many years. And he did this Wellbriety pole, and it has images of spirit beings that help you stay sober. He brings groups of children, of teenagers in to help him carve. And the whole process of carving is one to encourage sobriety. And so this is a pole of a very different sort than what we've seen already. Then to retell history in a Native way. This pole is in Sitka, and in the Sitka National Historic Park. The reason that the Sitka National Historical Park is called that is that it was the site, the Russian Tlingit battle of 1803. And in that particular area, only indications of this battle were references to the Russians. And by the way, the Tlingit won this battle. The Russians came back 3 years later and retook the land, but the Tlingit did win that battle in 1803. So Tommy Joseph, who's a Tlingit carver, made a pole on this land that was theirs, saying, we won this battle, and it's reclaiming the entire site. And at the very bottom, you see an image of a human-like figure, and then this is a bird head, which was the hat that the chief who led the battle and won wore. So this is an indication of like reclaiming history, sovereignty of land, and the great empowerment of Native people. So to summarize, the totem poles do represent, in this intercultural perspective that I have given you, they represent a response to real encounter. They were originated among Native people. They proliferated because of trade. They were abandoned at various times by pressures of governments and missionaries. They became celebrated by tourism when the Native people were no longer threats. And they then were admired by those who organized replication projects. And as in Seattle, they were appropriated by places that never had totem poles. And then finally, today, they were reappropriated by Native people themselves. And I think that's a very good way to end the story in a very positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldona.
Okay.
Let's see if we have questions for you. Here's one. I'm assuming that most of these poles were stolen from the culture and taken without permission.
Oh, wait, yes, but wait a minute. You have to allow me to have a video on. I can't do one without you allowing me to.
Let me allow you to do that again. Here we go.
The host has asked you to start your video. Start my video. Okay, great. Yes. Oh no. There were different ways that poles were acquired. I mentioned Governor Brady, who had extremely good relationships with the people of Southeast Alaska, because he had actually been a missionary, one of the really good guys, a missionary, and all the chiefs knew him and they respected him, and he respected their culture and them. And he said, I would like you to give me your poles so that I can preserve them and put them in a spot where they will last forever and be educational for your descendants. So that was not a thievery by any means. Some anthropologists who went to the Northwest to get poles, some of them actually paid for the poles. But then you had these not infrequently, people just came and stole them from abandoned villages. And when they were stolen, they were absolutely not given permission to take them.
And you have these shame poles and then these honoring poles. Is there a way to tell a difference? You know, because Uncle Sam was on the top, and then in one of the poles, the chief that they were honoring was on the very bottom with the bird's hat. Is there an order, or is it different by tribe?
Oh, wait a minute. No, first of all, the concept of low man on the totem pole is bunk. It's not true. The placement of the image on the pole has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the relevant importance of. That was my thing. I'm going to say stop, but I stopped even earlier. took very good care of my timing. Um, the images on poles really, they don't even follow a narrative sequence. There's clearly some reason to put the images where they are, but it more is a kind of more of a stylistic question. How does this work best together? Because even though some of them do tell, allude to stories being told, it is not a narrative form. It's not, it's not a storytelling pole per se. And so you can't really tell what a totem pole means just by looking at it, because these poles are intimately tied to the clans that own them. Now we're talking about the old style poles, the ones that were in the native villages. The stories, the myths that are told about the images were owned by the families. And even if something may be, oh, it's a raven, it's clearly a raven, or it's clearly a bear, it's not just any raven or any bear. It is the raven in the story that clan happens to own. And it's connected to a story. If there's another totem pole for another clan that has a raven on it, that is not the same raven. It's a different raven, a different story. And so somebody just looking at these images would say, oh, there's a bunch of ravens there. Identifying the images on a pole is very risky, because unless you know the stories, you're not going to understand what is being meant. You can't just look at these things and say, oh, well, this is this, and that's what the pole means. And so, no, if it's a shame pole, you wouldn't have been able to know that Uncle Sam and Seward were being shamed, and that the Chihuly and the Haubergs were being honored. I mean, it's pretty clear when you look at the pole at Pilchuk that it's a very respected pole. And if you look at Stephen Jackson's pole of Seward, the more recent, the one that was made just 2 years ago, it's clearly insulting. But it's not. It's really interesting with poles that they are so rich, culturally rich in their significance, that it takes a while to kind of, in any pole, to really understand what it means and who these images represent and how those images reflect back to the originating clan. And I mean, I unfortunately have known people who just look at poles and say, oh, that's a raven, that's a wolf. I now understand it. That's actually not really the case. And any Indigenous person can tell you that. And the other thing that is also relevant in this conversation is that these stories that are alluded to on the poles are they are owned by the clan. Now we're talking about historic poles where the poles were used in the community. They were shown in the village, those photographs of all the poles in front of the houses. And you were not the only person that had the privilege or the right to tell that pole. The story was the person in the clan. And so unless I've been given the right to tell the story of one of the poles, I avoid even interpreting the poles, because and I'm talking about the poles that are not like the Chihuly pole, which is something that is a different kind of image, because I don't have the right to tell those stories. But many books have the stories, and I mean, my books have stories too that I have been able to describe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of information and stories were taken without permission, and so it's important to
Absolutely.
acknowledge that. So, thank you, Aldona. We have another question here. How much influence do you think Emily Kerr had on making the Alaskan culture, especially totem poles, noticed?
Oh, isn't that interesting? Emily, it's Emily Carr
Oh, God,
is
sorry.
that's fine. One Columbia painter from the first several decades of the 20th century. And she is a beloved painter who lived in Victoria, and she went to a lot of the native villages in British Columbia and painted a lot of the poles, a lot of the villages, a lot of the people. And her work is very interesting record of what the British Columbia villages looked like at a certain point in time when there still were monuments to be raised. You know, I mean, I could have talked for, I mean, I've written 2 books about totem poles, so I focused mainly on Alaska, but I talked about British. And Lar was a very important source of information for later scholars who study and see interesting things in them. I hope that answers the. She didn't, as far as I know. Maybe she did. Remember that.
Yeah, I mean, your sound was cutting out a little bit, but I think we got the gist of it. And I do want to I'm going to put in the chat for those of you in the audience. We have a couple of the books of Aldona's in our collection at Deschutes Public Library if you wanted to check that out. So I put that in the chat. But it seems like Aldona's internet might be cutting out a little bit. But
sorry.
that's okay. It's living off the grid outside of Fairbanks life. So it's
right.
But I do want to thank you so much for talking to us about this and the real reality of what was taken and what Native peoples have taken back. I mean, the work of Stephen Jackson, the contemporary totem poles are incredible.
He's brilliant. He's brilliant. Yes.
Yeah, so I want to look at more of what he has done. So thank you everyone for joining us.